Okay, let's get started. I want to welcome everybody to the Bullet Points Lunchtime webinar series on firearm injury prevention for clinicians. I'm Amy Barnhorst. I'm going to be moderating today's session, and I'm really excited today to have Dr. Emmy Betz, one of my colleagues and friends, who's here to talk about what clinicians and families and caregivers can do to help people navigate the challenges associated with dementia and firearms. And I want to just start with a few announcements. So mark your calendar for every third Tuesday of the month at noon Pacific time, where we have our webinars, a quick 30 minutes. You can sit and eat your lunch while you listen and learn about firearm injury prevention. Next webinar is going to be October 19th at noon with Tate Gulzow, who's a psychologist with the suicide prevention program at the VA. And he's going to talk about how to prevent firearm suicide in veterans. We're going to have a poll at the beginning of today's webinar, and then again at the end. It's very brief, and these polls will help us understand where you're coming from, what you know as our audience, and what you learn from our webinars. So we really appreciate everybody taking the time to participate. And we're going to launch the first poll right now. So if you don't mind going through the questions, you'll have a minute or two to complete those, and then I'll introduce Dr. Betz. Okay, great. Thanks so much, everyone, for participating. And I want to remind folks also that because this is a webinar, the chat is disabled, but there is a Q&A function on the Zoom. So if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. I will go through them. Really simple stuff, you know, like your mic is muted or whatever. I will just answer in the chat. But at the end, I'll go through the Q&A and give some of the questions to Dr. Betz for further discussion. So please, please put thoughts or comments or questions you have in there. And without further delay, I will introduce Dr. Emmy Betz, who is a board-certified emergency physician who works at the University of Colorado Hospital. And she also does research in injury epidemiology and prevention. She's a professor of emergency medicine and the director of the Firearm Injury Prevention Initiative at the Injury and Violence Prevention Center, also at University of Colorado. And she's a research physician at the Geriatric Research Education and Clinical Core at the Eastern Colorado VA. Dr. Betz is a nationally recognized expert in firearm injury prevention and one of the people that I really enjoy working with the most on this topic. She particularly focuses on older adults and suicide prevention, and she co-founded and leads this really interesting and important initiative called the Colorado Firearm Safety Coalition, which is a collaborative effort between public health and medical professionals and firearm retailers who all get together and help reduce firearm suicides. She serves as a PI and co-I on multiple research projects that are funded through the NIH and other private foundations, and really focuses again on firearm access and dementia. So thank you so much for coming today, Dr. Betz, and I will let you take it away from here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barnhorst. Anything for you. It's always lovely to be here, and I'm a big fan of the work that you guys are doing in California. So thank you all for joining me today. I'm gonna be talking about dementia and firearms, some updates from the research world for both clinicians and for caregivers. And I will tell you, one of the take homes is that we have a lot of work to do. There's a lot we don't know, actually. So I encourage any of you who are interested in this area to jump in. There's lots of great work to be done and interesting questions to answer. So I do have a lot of research funding. I don't have any conflicts of interest for today's talk. The bigger conflict, or the bigger disclosure, I should say, is that I'm the lucky one who gets to be here today to talk to you, but I work with a large team, and over the years my work has been influenced by so many people around the country, and to all of them I am very grateful. Science really is a team sport, as probably many of you already know. So this is what I want to cover briefly in the next 15 minutes, kind of high level overview. What do we know about the rates and risks of firearm injury and dementia? What are some of the laws or logistical considerations? And then what do we know about the needs and experiences of caregivers, especially as it relates to how we as clinicians can support them? So first, to start with some numbers. So based on national surveys and national estimates, household firearm prevalence in Americans age 65 and older probably is similar to younger aged adults as well. So about a third being firearm owners themselves, about 12% not being an owner, but living with a firearm owner. We know there are geographic variations in firearm prevalence as well, but kind of nationally, we should think about older adults probably somewhat like middle-aged and younger adults. But what about in dementia? So this is where it's really hard. There's one survey that was in a clinical setting of a dementia clinic, and up to 60% of dementia patients in that clinic, their family said that there's a firearm in the home. I think that's probably on the high end. Certainly, any people living with dementia who are in, say, assisted living or memory care facilities can't have firearms anymore. But it's really hard to know what the prevalence is, what the actual access is. But if you multiply out, the low end and then up to 60% by the estimated number of people who will be living with dementia by 2050, you get some pretty significant numbers in terms of how many people might have cognitive impairment and have access to firearms. So we did a nationally weighted survey. This was published last year. The survey was of caregivers who themselves had firearms, but trying to get at the experiences of people with dementia. And so you can see here, this table shows both for the total sample as well as where the caregiver lived with the person with dementia or didn't live with them. And a couple of things I want to highlight. So first, among firearm owning caregivers who lived with the person with dementia, 31% said the person with dementia could still access guns within their home. So that to me highlights an opportunity for education and engagement to ensure safety. And then you can see among those, the range of kind of 10 to 30% who said that the person with dementia owns firearms themselves. Right, it gets complicated here because it's a question of, does the gun belong to the person with dementia or does it belong to the caregiver? And the way you address access might be different. In terms of thinking about actual injury risk, when we think about the older adult population, it's important to look at the sort of overall pattern so that we know what risks people are facing. This is from a project that I was a part of a few years ago where we looked at national age-adjusted death rates for both homicide on the left and suicide on the right. And what you can see is that the burden of death, the age-adjusted death rates are much higher for suicide than for homicide. And hopefully this doesn't come as a huge surprise to anyone. Older adults are more likely, to be injured by themselves in suicide than homicide or including intimate partner violence. And indeed, when we look at firearm deaths in the older adult population, about 91% are due to suicide. We know that firearms are the most common method of suicide among people with dementia, estimated at about 73% of deaths, suicide deaths in dementia use a firearm compared to 50% of all ages. And certainly dementia, especially at its early phases, may be a risk factor for suicide. In today's talk, I'm not going to be able to really dive into the fascinating, I think, philosophical, ethical questions around suicide in the later years and older adults, terminal illness, et cetera, and sort of how do we think about how firearm access overlaps with some of those issues. But a take-home message is that really in the context of older adults, including those with dementia, suicide is the leading injury risk in terms of total number of deaths and death rates. But we certainly think about homicide as well, and an intentional or unintentional harm to others. We know that dementia can involve various kinds of behavioral changes, psychotic symptoms, hallucinations, delusions, agitation, aggression, and so forth. And this is where it really depends on the individual in terms of the kinds of behavioral or memory problems that they're having and whether they pose a potential risk to family. Many caregivers do experience some form of violence from the person with dementia for whom they care, and that you can understand certainly if there's a firearm present, the risk of that violence being fatal certainly increases. But then there's an overlap, I think, when we think about sort of homicide or harm to others. Very often in the case of dementia, that's going to be an unintentional injury. So it may be that they're not recognizing the home healthcare worker who's coming to the house, or even a family member. And PBS did a really lovely story about 2 years ago, I think, where they talked about the story of a woman named Dee Hill, who was a caregiver for her husband, who I think was a retired law enforcement officer. He really was used to seeing his guns daily, sort of kept asking about it. And so one day she relented, let him look at one. She thought it was empty. Of course, you know what happens. He unfortunately, by accident, shoots her actually in the stomach. She calls 911, and she survives. And he actually never knew what happened. He was not cognitively aware enough to process the fact that he had shot her, and she ended up hospitalized and so forth. But this is the kind of case, although these are probably rare and we don't have great estimates, these are certainly the cases that caregivers understandably worry about. So what are some of the legal issues when we think about this? You know, is this something that we can count on policy to fix? The short answer is no, for right now. There's not a lot of legislation or policy work specifically around firearm access in dementia as a way to sort of reduce the risk. So only 2 states currently have laws on the books that specifically mention dementia, or in the case of Hawaii, organic brain syndrome. And neither of them really clarifies how it would be, how it's used, severity, and so forth. And I want to emphasize my view on all of this is that we want to support independent, healthy aging and rights of older adults for as long as possible, but recognizing that at some point in the progression of dementia, there comes a point when someone probably is no longer safe to have access. Federal background checks which are usually done at the point of sale or transfer. There is this terrible antiquated language around being a mental defective, but in most states that's a court judgment that might prevent a sale if it was somehow logged, but it's unlikely that it would. And so someone who has mild dementia probably wouldn't be flagged in the system, and so it probably wouldn't prevent them from acquiring a new weapon. I don't have time to dive into extreme risk protection orders or gun violence restraining orders today, but I will mention they certainly are one tool that caregivers could think about using. And in fact, on the California website, there's even this picture sort of getting at the issue of potential cognitive impairment and family members who might be concerned. And if people are interested later, I can go into a little bit more, some of what we know around how transfers might work if a caregiver is concerned and wants to do something with the firearm that actually belongs to the person with dementia. But now in the last couple of minutes, I really want to dive into some practical tips for both what we know about caregivers' experiences as well as what that means for clinicians. This is from the same nationally weighted survey that I mentioned earlier. So among these caregivers, and these were all dementia caregivers who also own firearms themselves, about 11% said that at some point they had had concerns about the person with dementia having firearm access. And in about half of those cases, they or someone else did something. We didn't have a free text answer to kind of dive more into why they didn't do something, or, you know, sort of, was it that they had had concern, but then someone else had taken care of it, for example. So you don't really know why that's not 100%. Really importantly, when we asked, hey, should healthcare professionals talk about firearm safety with caregivers or with patients with dementia, 45% said yes, always, and then 34% said at least sometimes. So the majority of people said yes, absolutely, this is something healthcare providers should be doing in the context of dementia. And yet only 5% said that they'd ever had a healthcare practitioner talk to them about firearm safety. I'm a healthcare provider myself. I know times are bad right now and we are burdened with a lot. So I certainly am not trying to add on to that burden, but I do think this is really a space where we need to recognize that, especially in primary care, geriatrics, you know, the worlds where there are longstanding relationships with patients and caregivers, this is a role that we can play. And caregivers and clinicians need resources on how to do this well. In the same survey, we asked people, what do they think about the risks? So you remember earlier I said suicide is the most common cause of firearm death in older people, and it's most likely the leading risk within the context of dementia. But we asked these caregivers, what do you think? What do you think is most likely for a person with Alzheimer's disease? Would they harm themselves on others, accidentally harm themselves or harm someone else? Would they harm themselves on purpose, or would they harm somebody else on purpose? And what you can see is most caregivers thought the sort of accidental harm to others was the most likely. Whereas we know, as I said earlier, that suicide is actually the most likely. So I think this also highlights to me that caregivers are concerned about potential harm to other people. But there's also a knowledge gap there about the risk of suicide and what is it that we can be doing to intervene in those cases and support families being healthy and feeling supported. So in terms of specific clinical recommendations, there are some guidelines out there. I'm going to show you one in a moment. None of them has been validated, tested extensively in healthcare systems. We don't have a sort of gold standard set of rules, but these are some recommendations about how to approach the topic in clinical settings. So the first is to recognize that dementia occurs across a trajectory from mild cognitive impairment, which can be really mild deficits. Somebody might have some objective deficits on testing, but their activities of daily living or their ADLs are generally intact. So they can drive, they can do grocery shopping, they sort of really are still pretty functional. In mild dementia, then people start having some memory loss that might interfere with at least one of those usual activities of daily living. Importantly, individuals might be aware of some deficits, but they're really lacking full insight to their condition. And so this is where family and friends might need to start to step in. And they may have some behavioral symptoms here, like hostility or aggression. Then moderate to severe dementia is really when people are having more profound impairment that's really limiting their ability to live on their own, do all their usual daily living kinds of needs. Usually there's some behavior, personality changes, and they may not recognize friends or family. And the time course for this progression is variable by the individual. So it's hard to give a specific sort of, X months from now is when you're going to need to do this. So in these first two stages, this is where clinicians might think about, for example, bringing up the topic, hey, does the person have access to firearms at home, along with other topics like driving, access to kitchen, other sort of, the stove, other potentially dangerous appliances. Asking about things like judgment, insight, personality changes, as well as risk factors for suicide, like depressive symptoms. And then in the earlier stages, certainly testing or referral for diagnosis of the cognitive impairment and potential treatment, depending on the cause. Consider assessment or training by firearm specialists. This is, in my book, it's hard. You could have the muscle memory to know how to still load a firearm, but not have the awareness to be able to use it appropriately or react in a situation. But really, this is a space in the mild cognitive impairment where ideally people can be engaging the older adult themselves in planning for future changes. Because again, we really want to be involving the older adult in making decisions for themselves as much as possible. In the mild dementia range, this is where it might be appropriate for somebody to still have supervised or restricted access to firearms, probably not unrestricted, but maybe it's okay to still be going hunting once a year or going to the range, those kinds of things, but I'm starting to make some changes. And then really moderate to severe dementia, the screening question really should just be, do they have access? And they really should not have access, maybe even supervised, unless it's very closely supervised, and certainly asking questions about sort of, especially if there are behavior, depressive symptoms, personality problems, and the person has access, that should be considered something, at the level of immediate risk. And one of the tips I heard from a social worker who I've learned a ton from, who does a lot of counseling on this in a veteran population, is the importance of, for family and for caregivers, pointing out that it's the disease, it's not the person. So mom or dad might have always been safe with firearms. Maybe it was part of their job. Maybe they, maybe it was hunting, maybe it was protection of the family. And the disease is the problem. So it can be hard for people to think that their spouse might shoot them in the middle of the night, for example. No one wants to think that, but sort of pinning it on the disease and it's the changes that this disease has brought can potentially make it a little bit easier for people to accept that dad is not who dad used to be, and it's the disease's fault that that's happened, and it's important to make changes, though. In terms of what those changes are, it's across the spectrum. So it can be locking up firearms securely at home, so the person with dementia doesn't have access, doesn't have the key or the passcode. It can be disabling the gun in some cases if the person with dementia is very agitated at not being able to handle their weapons, if they were used to doing it daily. The family might consider disabling it such that the person with dementia can't tell, but they can still touch it, recognizing that could pose an issue if for some reason the police came one day and thought it was a weapon and so forth. But this is where it really comes down to family decisions. Certainly, people can consider storing it off-site, talking with law enforcement if they don't want the firearms anymore and they want them out of circulation, or talking with a retailer or other licensed dealer if they're thinking about selling them. I want to close with just making a plug for early planning. We in another nationally representative survey asked questions of older firearm owners, what they had done in terms of planning ahead. In this group, age 65 and up, 18% had carried a loaded handgun in the past month. So many of them were still actively engaged with their firearms. And yet only 20% had made a plan for what to do if they developed dementia or another condition that would impair them. And I really think this is an area where we can be helping older adults have agency and make decisions themselves. A couple of years ago, we developed the Firearm Advanced Directive as kind of a conversation starter for people to think about who would you trust to tell you when it's time, what would you want to happen. I will say version 2.0 is coming really soon. We're hard at work on it. I can't share it yet, but that's a teaser to come back and check in with us, that we hope we're making some resources that will be useful for the firearms community. We also recently created a web tool called Safety and Dementia to help caregivers think through some of these issues. And we're really thrilled. We just this week got funding from the National Institutes of Health to test this tool for effectiveness to see if it helps caregivers in making decisions. And then to end, I just want to say this is going to take all of us. So in the same national survey, we asked caregivers, where do you want to get information from? Where would you look? And the take home for me was it was varied. So there were a lot of people who said absolutely they would use family and friends, dementia groups. Smaller proportions said that they would look to firearm organizations, but it wasn't zero. And on the flip side, there are many people who said they really wouldn't look to healthcare professionals, and many who would. And so I think we really need resources and tools across a broad spectrum of options for people. And that is where I'm going to end. Actually, this is where I'm going to end, which is to put in a plug that we're hiring for our new study. So if you're interested in dementia, we have an opening for a research assistant. But now I would love, Dr. Barnhorst, to turn it back over to you to see if there are any questions that I can answer. And for the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Betz. That was an awesome and very informative presentation. I learned a lot from it, actually, because this is kind of a new field, I think, in the terms of firearm injury prevention in a population we don't always think about. Before we go to the Q&A, so I do want to encourage, we have a couple really good questions in the chat, so I want to encourage people to put more in there. But we're going to do the closing poll. So let's do that real quick, and then we'll get to these questions. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for your answers on the poll. And a couple great questions for you. One of them is, there's something of a protocol for people who have dementia and driving. And so there's a point at which they legally can have their driver's license. Is that a model that could potentially work for firearms? And can you talk a little bit about that analogy?
Yeah, so I will say, I actually got into this space in part because we've done work with driving and we kept hearing the analogy and sort of thinking about how it's similar or different. I will say the driving side is still a little messy too. So it's not perfect on that side. And it still often requires kind of a physician to weigh in, or an occupational therapist, and or the DMV. I think what's tricky is that for driving, you actually have a license. There's sort of two things. There's the legal part, do you have a license? And then there's, do you have access to a car, right? So you could lose your license and still get behind the wheel if you have access to the keys. obviously, depending on the state you live in, there may not be the legal equivalent of a driver's license in terms of the firearm ownership. So to me, it's more about do you have access to the keys, and for families to kind of think through what that means. I do think there are a lot of parallels that people understand in sort of thinking about your risk to the community, and that firearms like driving kind of appeal to people's sense of identity and so forth. And I think it's probably fair to say if you shouldn't be driving, you probably shouldn't have access to guns. I mean, if you think about the complexity of the tasks. So I think we need to continue our work in understanding how those pieces parallel each other and whether there's space for policy or not. But at the end of the day, I don't actually know that it's sort of a government place to step in some ways. It's because it's more about the act of reducing access, in the same way that a lot of people with cognitive impairment or other things probably never get their driver's licenses revoked. They just stop driving.
Right. Yeah, good point. Okay, we have another question about how much pushback you get in Colorado from gun control opponents. How do they receive your work?
From gun control or from gun rights?
Gun control opponents, so gun rights advocates.
Okay, fair. Yeah. So I actually get it from both sides sometimes. That's why I asked. I think sometimes there are people on the sort of gun control side who say there's no place to work together. You're advocating for people to own guns, et cetera, et cetera. There are people on the gun rights side who sometimes think like this is you're just making an issue out of nothing and you're just trying to confiscate guns and so forth. I consider both of those loud voices on the edges. And I think most of us are in this space in the middle where we want our families to be healthy. We want to prevent injuries. We want to prevent death. We want to encourage healthy aging and independence. And so I just try to shut out the trolls.
Good strategy. Okay, we've reached the 12:30 mark. So I just want to thank everybody who's coming and people who have to go. We have one more question in the chat that I'm going to, if it's okay with you,
yeah, for sure.
Out there. So feel free to stay. And but thank you all, and hope to see you in October as well for our Veterans and Firearm Suicide webinar. So this question is, what specific and observable behaviors should family or household members be on the lookout for to decide at what point they should think about revoking firearm access from their family member with dementia?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it has to do with memory and recognition. So if somebody's really not recognizing trusted, family members, for example, that's to me is a big red flag, because it could pose a risk in the middle of the night, say to the family members, or could pose a risk to somebody else coming over to the house. And then also significant behavior changes. So agitation, aggression. People can sometimes have paranoia and sort of new symptoms that were not part of the way they used to be. They might still have the muscle ability to use a firearm, but it's really about are they still responsible in how they can handle it? Can they think through their actions and the ramifications of potentially shooting someone? And if they can't, then that's really, and I also would say trust your gut, right? If it's your family, yes, it's hard to do this, but imagine if something happened to them or to someone else in the household. Better to be on the safe side.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we will wrap up now since we're at time. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Betz, for this awesome presentation, and thanks to everyone who joined us. And we'll see you next month.
Great, thanks so much for having me.